Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel on day 2 of the Urban Arc. I'm Namrata Kapoor. I'm going to be the chair for this panel on urban housing dynamics, inequities, and social realities. We have 6 papers with us today. They're going to cover a host of topics from homelessness, ghettoization, social housing for the transgendered, and spatial methods, paper on understanding gentrification. But we'll start with the one on rental housing. Minu from the University of Hyderabad is going to present her paper on producing marginalities in rental spaces of peri-urban Hyderabad. A couple of things before we start though, make sure all of you all speak into the mic. So just pull the mic into a position that's comfortable for you all. Please pay attention to the time intervals. Gioia, my colleague over here, is going to signal your time intervals from time to time. And folks online, please pay attention to the chat. There will be messages from time to time. So without much further ado, Minu, let's start with you.
Thank you. Am I audible? Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me, first of all. And 2 things. One, I'm only done with my pilot study. I've only scoped out a couple of colonies in this particular area and a few interviews. And this is me testing out an idea. And I do want to hear your inputs and I want to improve on this paper. 2, I really don't know if I actually belong in this panel, but well, we'll decide that later. So I'll just go with my paper right now. I'm not going to every kind of sections that I've gone with because I thought I had 12 minutes. I'll put it as precisely as possible. I'm sorry I don't have PPTs. My title is Producing Marginalities in the Rental Spaces of Peri-urban Hyderabad City. So to give you a context, I should give you what is peri-urban Hyderabad City. And this is where I started my research work as well from my MPhil. Where is the peri-urban in Hyderabad? When you look at the papers that have come out in the early 2000s and all of that, you see the predominant kind of focus on what is Hyderabad and what is coming as this new project that is initiated by the state. So to give you a context, the AP Vision 2020 document was released in 1999 by the then CM of the erstwhile United Andhra Pradesh for this vision of Hyderabad city, as it was going to be like the Singapore model to come here in the western fringes of particularly the already existing Hyderabad city. So in that project, there has also, in the same amount of time, in the next 10 years, you actually had the Special Economic Zones Act coming out. So a bunch of special economic zones came out in the same area. Then there was a consolidation of the municipal corporation under the GHMC or the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation. Then different development authorities became consolidated under the HMDA or Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority. So when I started out, my area was something that came in the HMDA, but outside GHMC. So it was one of those things that had a master plan, but the municipal authorities themselves did not know exactly where they fit in, if they actually had, they didn't even know enough about how many people actually resided in those areas because so many special economic zones were under IALAs or industrial area local authorities. Ashima Sood and Lorraine Kennedy have talked about it. Please do read about it. I'm just giving you a context of what is peri-urban. It is itself a very fuzzy area in Hyderabad. And the focus has always been on the IT corridor and the financial district. And that is what constitutes Hyderabad for them. So I wanted to look at the residential spaces. And this is where my focus has come to now, particularly to the rental spaces. So my larger question was about how do rental practices drive the urban process in the city? And in this, I've also looked at who and what constitutes the urban rental spaces in these particular areas. So I'm just giving you a context of that. Yes. So you do know that the residential boom has happened in different places. Right after the pandemic, the rental hike is something that has been reported widely. I'm guessing you understand this in Bangalore much more. But it is very similar in Hyderabad. It is these specific spaces itself that is actually unaffordable to many sections of even what they call the middle class. But a very small section, a very minute section of people have found work and residence in these very unaffordable places as watchmen. And this is the section that I'm concentrating on in this paper. So what is the role of the watchman? Again, I do have to give a little more context on the rental spaces. There are rental spaces that have come out in luxury condos and luxury apartments, gated communities. But I am looking at something that is outside. There are two sections. One, people who have converted or added different floors to their houses, and they have sublet different parts of that. And people who have bought full land parcels or maybe even raised down their houses to create residential apartment blocks. And these watchman communities that I have talked with, or at least these streets that I've gone to, are falling in the last category. It's the apartment complexes that are built by individuals that are outside the glossy brochures that you'll find in property shows. 5 minutes. Okay. I'll just come to the role of the watchman itself, because I believe that they form a very vital link in producing these kind of rental spaces even possible, to make it even possible. So when I say watchman, it is actually used or denoted in a singular term. But you actually, if you go to these places, you see that there is no place that they sit somewhere that's not a uniformed guard, but it is a full family of people who actually reside in a one room kind of living space that is actually attached to the parking garages of these formally built apartment complexes. It is part of their formal plans, but it is a bunch of informal roles that all of these people who are there do together, but they're all denoted by this one singular term, the watchman. So the roles would include from security guard, being the security guard, closing and opening the gates according to a curfew that the landlords would be saying, to cleaning common areas, to taking out waste, to even doing minor repairs, maintenance work, and all of those. All the things that whatever they can do, it all falls in the purview of the watchman. The spaces that they have taken up, they have made it their own in different ways. I have stayed in some of these apartment complexes during summer and during different weathers, but specifically during summer, you can see that because there are so many family members who stay together, they actually maybe take out their mattresses and stay in the parking garages, and they make their own. There is one apartment complex I remember where the one section that was not used for any kind of parking, people actually used it for putting a kind of abandoned sofa. There's a TV set. They do their washing in there. They made these kind of spaces their own. So these particular watchman communities are actually very important for the presence of for the landlords to be able to be absent in these spaces. While a lot of landlords do live in the same apartment blocks, many of them are professional classes. It's not their full-time job to be landlords, unlike maybe the urban villages that Sushmita Pati would talk about in the book. It's not their full-time job, and they might even have multiple apartments. They might be NRIs, but they can entrust these watchmen to take care of the conflicts, of issues, that everything that the tenants have in these places. But they also do not compare to a superintendent, let's say in a Western context, because they do not have the power to evict people in there. If there is any kind of issues, the role is still, there is no enough power that the watchman holds, but they do encompass a lot of these. I wouldn't call the superintendents their Western counterparts because of that, but it's just a frame of reference for you to understand. So these watchman communities have come from different parts of rural Andhra Pradesh. I could not go into details about the native villages and the caste locations of these the people. I do have to follow up on that. But this is the hook for them, that they will have a residential kind of location for them to be in the city, to work in the city. These people have also brought in their native people from the native villages, people from their extended families to work in apartment complexes in the same street. And so they have recreated their same kind of support networks in these cities as well. The same women of the family, by the way, work in individual apartment complexes as cooks or maids, or even in apartment complexes that are nearby, and this way they augment their income. So these are the different ways in which they kind of navigate their work and space, residential space in the city. And I thought this was very important to actually see as a who constitutes the rental space, going back to my question. But I also have to, I'll probably just conclude because I'm nearby, near my time. I don't want to glorify this as this is only about agency, because I lived in one of those places. I started living in rental spaces when it was during the pandemic, and offices had not started fully and schools had not fully started back. I could see a lot of the children, two of the children of the families that I was, in the watchman family that I was living in the same apartment complex with, they were actually around and playing around a lot of the time in the daytime. They were 8 years and 13 years old. But they were also contributing to the labor. So there is a lot of invisibilized kind of family, gendered labor that is actually present in these spaces. When I asked the kids about which classes they belong to, the second kid, the younger kid, was saying, "Oh yeah, I'm in the second class." But the elder one was hesitant to say that. I don't know if they went back to those classes when the schools did reopen. Whether it is something that is going to continue, I don't know. I actually did not go back to that place to know about it. So whether the aspirations of this class, these watchmen who have come here, their own personal aspirations get followed up here is a different question. So I just wanted to leave it there, and I'd probably get more inputs later. Thank you.
Thank you, Minu. We will move on to the next presentation. We will take questions and answers right at the end. So please start jotting down any questions that you may have for the panelists. Okay. We will now move to our paper on social housing and social mobility of the urban poor transgendered people, positive deviants from resettlement sites in Chennai. Rekha and Induja are here, and your colleagues Sunitha and Velayutham are online. Okay, so Rekha and Induja will present.
Hi, good morning everyone. Myself Rekha and she is Induja. We are representing as a part of C4D Urban Living Lab from Department of Media Sciences, Anna University, Chennai. We are presenting here paper Social Housing and Social Mobility of the urban poor transgender people, a positive deviance from resettlement sites of Chennai. We have done this study under the guidance of Dr. Sunitha Bosco and Dr. C. Velayutham. So here we represent for C4D Urban Lab, Living Lab, we do this with concentrates on urban marginalized communities, urban poor in resettlement sites, urban poor in informal settlements, and gender minorities. So here we have an overview of what transgender actually is. Transgender people have discrimination for centuries due to their non-conforming sexual identity in India. This has hindered their access to resources, support networks, and opportunities for their personal growth and development. So in the year 2014, the Supreme Court of India, in its landmark judgment, declared the transgender as a third gender and gave them their civil rights. There was a phenomenal change in the way transgenders were looked upon in India. In the year 2008, Tamil Nadu established the country's first ever transgender welfare board. So I'll pass on. Then the challenges faced by the transgender individuals. Since the Supreme Court has given them their own civil rights also, they granted certain privileges to transgender people. They still face high levels of violence, discrimination, exclusion and marginalizations like social isolations, limited access to resources, and housing challenges. So now Induja will carry on the further research.
So for years now, many experts have spoken about adequate shelter and the need for housing services. And also the Constitution of India grants these fundamental rights to protect the human right of adequate housing. But one group of people, the transgender people, have been denied this right to housing or shelter for so long now. So, aiming to counter the housing problem of transgender people, numerous states have taken up the housing and shelter programs like Maharashtra, Gujarat, Delhi, West Bengal, and many other states. And the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment also has initiated a project recently called Garima Greh. While this is happening recently, Tamil Nadu government has extended this social housing program for transgenders way back in 2015. The Tamil Nadu government had allotted 256 tenements as an experimental basis for transgender people in the resettlement sites of Chennai city. So I would like to say that Tamil Nadu had pioneered in extending their support to transgenders by recognizing their housing needs way before. So we focus on our research question, like how social housing has enabled these transgender people achieve social mobility in the resettlement sites of Chennai. So here we present you a positive deviance case study of transgender people to understand how housing has helped these marginalized transgender people in their lives. So we conducted a qualitative study among 25 transgender people residing in NNO resettlement site of Chennai, and we observed the diffusion of social housing and its impact on transgender people through a qualitative method such as in-depth interviews, focus groups, and participant observations. So for the presentation purpose, we would like to add a small video which will cover our findings majorly.
ஒரு வீடு தான் வந்து ஒரு மனிதனுக்கு வந்து பெரிய விஷயம். இப்போ ஆண் பெண் என்னும்போது 6 சொந்தக்கார வீட்டிலலாம் சேர்த்துக்குவாங்க. எங்களை வந்து எங்கள் சொந்தக்கார வீட்டில் வந்து 2 நாளுக்கு மேலே வைக்க மாட்டாங்க. பக்கத்தில் இருக்கிறவங்கெல்லாம் ஒரு மாதிரி பேசுவாங்கன்னுட்டு.
இதுக்கு முன்னாடி பார்த்தீங்கன்னா திருநங்கைகளுக்கு வந்து வீடே கொடுக்க மாட்டாங்க. அதுதான் பெரிய பிரச்சனையாகவே இருந்தது. அப்படியே வீடு கொடுத்தா நார்மல் பீப்புளுக்கு 2000 ரூபாய் வாடகைன்னா எங்களுக்கு வந்து 5000 ரூபாய் வாடகையாக இருக்கும். நார்மல் பீப்புளுக்கு கரண்ட் பில் வந்து 7 ரூபாய்னா எங்களுக்கு வந்து 15 ரூபான்னு இருக்கும். அது மட்டும் இல்லாமல் வாரமான ஞாயிற்றுக்கிழமை நான் கறி எடுக்கிறேன்னா நான் 1/2 கிலோ கறி எடுத்தேன்னா அவங்களுக்கும் 1/2 கிலோ கறி எடுத்து கொடுக்கணும். இதெல்லாமே நடந்தது. ஏன்னா நீங்கள் என்ன உங்களுக்கெல்லாம் என்ன நீங்கள் அழகாக ஈஸியாக சம்பாதிக்கிறீங்கன்னு. பாலியல் தொழில் செஞ்சாலும் கடை கேட்டாலும் அதில் இருக்க கஷ்டம் எங்களுக்கு தான் தெரியும், உங்களுக்கு யாருக்கும் தெரியாது.
நம்மளுக்குன்னு ஒரு சொந்த வீடு இருந்தால் யாருக்கும் நம்ம கை கட்டி பதில் சொல்ல தேவையில்லை. அப்படி இருக்கும்போது தான் குடிசை இல்லாத தமிழகத்தை உருவாக்கும் அப்படின்னு சொன்ன குடிசை மாற்று வாரியத்தில் வந்து நாங்கள் இப்போ நேரடியாக அணுகணும். அங்கே அணுகுமுறைன்னு பார்க்கும்போது ஒரு நபர்களுக்கு வந்து எந்த ஊர்லேயும் வந்து வீடுகள் கொடுத்ததில்லை அப்படின்றது தான் நாங்கள் கேள்விப்பட்டோம். சென்னையில் வந்து அதுமாதிரி கொடுக்க மாட்டாங்க, பெரிய சிட்டின்றதால நாங்கள் நிறைய ப்ரொட்டஸ்ட் பண்ணோம். அது மூலிமா தான் வந்து எங்களுக்கு 2016 மார்ச் 1 மறைந்த முன்னாள் ஜெயலலிதா அம்மாவோட கரங்களவில் நான் முதல்ல வந்து அலாட்மெண்ட் வந்து
256 பேர் கொடுத்தாங்க.
எர்ணாவூர் சுனாமி குடியிருப்பில்.
ஃபஸ்ட்டு வீடு கொடுக்கும் போதெல்லாம் வந்து எங்களை வந்து யாரும் ஏற்றுக்கல. கத்தி கபடை கட்டை எல்லாமே கொண்டு வந்தாங்க. அந்த ஸ்லம் கிளியரன்ஸ் ஆஃபீஸ்க்குள்ளே எங்களை அடிக்கலாம் வந்தாங்க. ஆனால் யாருமே அங்கே புரிதல் இல்லை, புரிஞ்சு ஏற்றுக்கல. அதுக்கப்புறம் 5 பேரா 10 பேரா வீடு வரவும் மக்களாக பழகும் போது தான் திருநங்கைகளே இவ்வளோ நல்லவங்களாம் இருக்காங்க, நல்லா பேசுகிறவங்களும் இருக்காங்க, உழைக்கிறவங்களும் இருக்காங்கன்னு சொல்லிட்டு எங்ககிட்ட பேசி எங்ககிட்ட பழகம் வந்தாங்க.
நாங்கள் வடச்சென்னையில் வந்து ஸ்நேகிதின்ற அமைப்பை வந்து நாங்கள் வச்சு கடந்த 10 ஆண்டு காலமாக வேலை செஞ்சு வரோம்.
நாங்கள் நிறைய வேலைகள் பார்த்துட்டு இருக்கோம். எப்படின்னு பார்த்தீங்கன்னா, நாங்கள் எல்லா வேலைகளுமே வந்து அரசாங்கத்துக்கும் மக்களுக்கும் இடையக்கூடிய வேலைகளை தான் பார்த்துட்டு இருக்கோம். முதல் வந்து நம்மளுடைய நலவாரிய கார்டு, அதுக்கப்புறம் ஆதார் கார்டு, அப்புறம் ஓட்டர் ஐடி, ரேஷன் கார்டு, பேங்க் பாஸ்புக்கு, கேஸ் பில்லு, இந்த மாதிரியான நிறைய கவர்மெண்ட் ஸ்கீம் நம்மளுக்கு என்னெல்லாம் கிடைக்குதோ அதெல்லாமே தான் நம்ம பண்ணிட்டு இருக்கோம். அதில் ஸ்பெசிஃபிக்காக வந்து நம்ம 2016 மார்ச் 1 வந்து 256 பேருக்கு வந்து வீடு வாங்கி கொடுத்த பெருமையே வந்து ஸ்நேகிதி அமைப்பு வந்து ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக எடுத்துக்கிச்சு.
என் பேர் ஷானு. இருந்த வீட்டில் வந்து ஒரு 10 பேர் 5 பேர் போவோம். ஒரு பாத்ரூம் வந்துட்டா கூட கொஞ்சம் வெயிட் பண்ணி தான் போகணும். அவங்க போயிட்டு வந்த பிறகு நம்ம போக முடியும். இப்போ வந்து நம்ம இஷ்டம். குளிக்கணும்னா கூட நம்ம தனி பாத்ரூம் இருக்குது, டாய்லெட் இருக்குது, கிச்சன் தனியாக நம்ம சமைச்சிக்கலாம், தனித்தனியாக இருக்குது, எல்லாமே ஒரு அதனால கொஞ்சம் பெஸ்ட்டாக இருக்குது.
என்னோட இது வந்து இதுதான் வாழ்க்கை.
அங்கே நிறைய மக்கள் வந்து இப்போ சுயதொழில் செய்கிறாங்க, சுயமாக வேலைக்கு போகிறாங்க. இப்போ ஆப்ரேஷனில் இருக்கக்கூடிய வேலைக்கு வந்து கூட நம்ம திருநங்கை மக்கள் வந்து ஒரு 12 பேர்கிட்ட வேலை செஞ்சுட்டு இருக்காங்க. அது எங்களுக்கு ரொம்ப சந்தோஷம்.
நான் ஒரு கார்பரேஷனில் ஒர்க் பண்ணுறேன், திருப்பம் பள்ளியாராக வேலை செய்கிறேன். வண்டி ஓட்டுறேன், 3 வருஷமாக ஓட்டுறேன். இது ஒரு கொஞ்சம் பரவாயில்ல எங்களுக்கு லைஃப்பில். இன்னும் வர காலங்களில் நம்ம மாதிரி திருநங்கைகள் இந்த மாதிரி வேலை செஞ்சு ஒரு முன்னேற்றம் வரணும். அவங்களுக்கு வரும்போது எதிர்ப்பு இருந்தது, அப்புறம் போக போக எல்லாம் ஒன்று அண்ணன் தங்கச்சி மாதிரி, அம்மா பொண்ணு மாதிரி எல்லாம் பழக ஆரம்பிச்சிட்டாங்க. சின்ன பசங்களும் அம்மா அம்மான்னு கூப்பிடுவாங்க எங்களை. நாங்களும் எதுவும் பார்த்துப்போம், நல்லா ஜாலியாக இருப்போம். அவ்வளோதான்.
எங்களுக்குன்னு ஒரு சொந்த வீடு இருக்கும்போது எங்களுக்கு பெரும் கௌரவம். 2வது எங்களுக்கு உழைச்சி சாப்பிட்றதுக்கான ஒரு நேரம். வீடு இல்லாமல் யாராவது எங்களை நாடி வந்து அவங்களுக்கு ஆதரிக்கிறதுக்கு அது ஒரு இடமா இருக்குது. இப்போ நாங்கள் நிறைய பல்வேறு அமைப்புகள் வச்சுருக்கிறோம், எல்லாம் ஒன்று கூடி வேலை செய்கிறோம். நிறைய பேருக்கு இல்லாதவங்களுக்கு நாங்கள் வந்து உதவி செய்கிறோம்.
So, to conclude, social housing for transgender people is very important to give them their rights. So, looking at what they have achieved through this social housing is, 1 is stability, 2 is they can come out of their sex work, 3 safety and security, 4 a dignified life, 5 social acceptance, 6 warmth, 7 social mobility, 8 social assets. So, I would like to present only 2 quotes from the perspective of transgenders, which had a great impact. So, Priya had said, "I don't have a choice. I have no source of income, and therefore I'm pushed to take up sex work to lead my life. If I had a house of my own, my expenses would reduce a lot, and I would definitely give up sex work." Abhirami had said, "It was not easy for us to get our own house. Say, like, if we had the support of 2 out of 10 people, the other 8 opposed us. They threatened us with knives and sickles to vacate the place immediately. But the scenario has changed now. Gradually, people recognized our virtues and hard work and started to mingle with us every day. Children in my neighborhood fondly call me Amma." So, therefore, we see there has been social acceptance among the society who had rejected them in the initial phase. And that's it. We would like to conclude.
Okay, we'll move on to the next paper, Understanding Bangalore's Urban Growth Pattern Through the Lens of Gentrification, a spatio-temporal analysis by Sagar, who's here. Over to you, Sagar.
Good morning, everyone. I am Sagar Sinha. I am a PhD scholar at Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. This is a part of my PhD work that we'll be presenting here. I'll be presenting a spatio-temporal analysis to understand Bangalore's urban growth with respect to gentrification. So to begin with, the definition of gentrification, it was initially coined by Ruth Glass in 1964, where she defines gentrification as a movement of upper class people, who she referred to as gentry, into the worker class resident, where those upper class people take up their residences and open businesses with external investments. We know that globalization and neoliberal urbanism has a huge impact in the development of city and has resulted in urban restructuring of various cities. Specifically, if we could talk about Bangalore, it has resulted in transformation of it has led to formation of special economic zones and agglomeration of knowledge-based IT industries. This has led to improved job opportunity and in both the sector, both formal sector as well as the informal sector. Increased migration has resulted in both the socioeconomic extremes, where the lower income people demand for the basic services and the affordable houses, where the affluent group or the high income people demanded for the luxury and high-rise condominiums. Also, we know that urban planning policy in India are more of favoring towards the elite group of people. So this led to the out-migration of vulnerable population of the various neighborhoods. So we can say that India's urban redevelopment revealed a complex and an additional dimension of gentrification in its redevelopment process. Why we need to study about gentrification? So there are two important points that we need to remember while we are studying about gentrification. The first is residential property in India are even sold out even before they are constructed, and though the wealth that accumulated by the contractors are again led to purchase of new land or in acquisition of the lands. And the second is that the land disposition and property investment done by the affluent are not in the city center, but at the city periphery. Especially if we talk about, we see that the Noida or Delhi NCR, beyond Electronic City in Bangalore. So we have found out that we identified there are 4 basic patterns of gentrification that relate to this typology. And these 4 gentrification patterns are new build gentrification, rural gentrification, retail gentrification, or also we can call it commercial gentrification, and peripheral gentrification. Coming on to my research objective, I'll be focusing upon 2 research objectives. First is to analyze the alteration in landscape pattern associated with urbanization through utilization of landscape expansion model. And the second is to assess how urban growth process align with gentrification phenomena through examination of housing price dynamics and by verifying the development of the neighborhood through ground truthing. My research methodology include both quantitative as well as qualitative aspect, and I'll be comprehending urban growth and gentrification pattern based on a specific defined set of rules. So I have used landscape expansion index. From here on, I'll be referring to it as LEI. And from this, we have identified the pattern of gentrification. Basically, there are 3 types of growth that we can identify from landscape expansion index. The first one is outlying type growth, where the expansion of new urban patches are not related with the old urban patches. That means that both the patches are at 2 separate places. The second is edge expansion. In this, new patches are surrounded by the older patches, but it do not exceed by 50%. And the third one is infill type of growth, in which the new patches are directly engulfed in between the older patches, or they are surrounded by more than 50% of the older patches. So buffer distance plays an important role in consideration of this type of growth, and we calculate the buffer distance around the newer patch and relate it with the older patch to find how much percentage or how much it is related with the newer patch and the older patch. So there are a lot of pros and cons with different type of buffer distance that we take. And to conclude, we have taken the spatial buffer distance equal to spatial resolution of the data that is being used. In my case, I have used Landsat data, so I have taken 30 meter resolution data. So I have taken buffer distance to be 30 meter. So with the various pattern of gentrification that we identified earlier, and the different type of growth pattern that we identified through landscape expansion model, we try to relate both the gentrification pattern and the pattern that LEI tried to give us. And we found out that the outlying type of growth refers or resemble with rural gentrification. Edge expansion type of growth resemble with peripheral gentrification or retail gentrification, whereas the infill type of growth resemble with the new build gentrification. I'll not go into demographics and the economic characteristic of Bangalore. I have done my pilot survey in across a lot of neighborhood in Bangalore, so I have clustered and clustered all the interviews and make a big cluster, not to coincide in the same area, and divide into 5 neighborhoods. These are a few images and my observation from the landscape expansion model. I'll just jump to my results and conclusion. So we can see that out of 4 out of 5 neighborhood, it has. We can see that the newer patches are. There are a lot of newer patches that has come up within the 2 decades. That is of my analysis. That is, the first decade was 2001 to 2011, and the second decade was 2011 to 2021. And also, except the Doda Banaswadi, which is currently a residential area, prominently residential area, it has the number of new patches has reduced in that cluster only. I have also done housing cost. I have tried to identify housing cost from various real estate classified platforms, and found out that all the 5 neighborhoods have shown upward trends in the housing price. Coming on to my results and discussion, first prominent result that I found out, the overall prominent result that I found out was that on an average, 30 to 40% of the neighborhood shows an edge expansion trend in both the decade. So overall, the edge expansion remained constant, whereas if we talk about the outlying growth, it was prominent in 2001 to 2011, whereas the infill growth has become prominent in 2011 to 2021. If we talk about if we talk about area-specific or neighborhood-specific development, Doda Banaswadi, which is a residential area, has shown an infill sort of development, which highlights a new build gentrification. Second is Pinia industrial area, which is one of the oldest manufacturing industry in India, and it showcases densification and neighborhood redevelopment, highlighting new build gentrification. The third is Whitefield and Electronic City. It has undergone greenfield expansion and infill development. So the neighborhood has exhibited. The neighborhood shows a unique fabric of coexistence of both low-rise residences resulted from early greenfield development, and high-density housing complexes also resulting from later on infill development. Thus, this highlights peripheral gentrification or retail gentrification. The last cluster is Atibele, which is a new emerging town or outgrowth, which highlights rural gentrification. Coming to my conclusion, Bangalore is a prominent hub of human capital and knowledge-based industry, which has continuously undergone structural and spatial reconfiguration. The emergence of gentrification is closely tied with demographic shift and particularly influx of human capital. The growth in knowledge economy has led to substantial urbanization in the capital, in the city. Sorry, the study effectively utilizes a landscape expansion model to assess spatial segregation based upon patch-based development, patch-based land use classification. The neighborhood development primarily exhibit the characteristics of both outward expansion and infill growth, highlighting the expansion of developed area and development or the redevelopment of previously underutilized land within the existing urban fabric. Our finding also substantiated with housing price dynamics and on-ground observation provide a comprehensive understanding of gentrification phenomena in the Bangalore. limitation, as all the researchers have limitation, and I won't go ahead because of shortage of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sagar. We will now move online. We will move to Sneha Maria, who's going to present her paper on Between Surviving and Thriving, the Marginality of the Urban Homeless. Over to you, Sneha.
Yeah. So a very good morning to my respected audience and my fellow panelists. My name is Sneha and I'm a recent graduate from London School of Economics. And the title of the research I'll be presenting today is Between Surviving and Thriving, the Marginality of the Urban Homeless. So I'd like to start with this sketch that I made while I was conducting my participant observation in Majestic railway station in Bangalore. So I'd spent about an hour observing this man sitting on the pavement, filling his water bottle at the public tap. And by that time, I developed an assumption of what I could expect when I spoke to him. So I expected to hear narratives about poverty, unemployment, strained familial relations. But when I did end up speaking to him, he presented a completely different picture. He told me that he was a mason, that he earned around 20,000 rupees every month, and he was sitting there waiting for his labor contractor to come and pick him up. So the reason why I start with this anecdote is because the urban homeless have come to occupy a position that Ban describes as simultaneous hypervisibility and invisibility. So if you look at official statistics, they are undercounted, while if you look at popular discourse, they are visibilized, but through self-reinforcing tropes as victims who need to be pitied or heroes who need to be admired. So the objective of my research was to show that the urban homeless are not just victims, they are also active urban agents who implement complex habitational, livelihood, and social strategies. So the existing literature that looks at the lived experience of the urban homeless brings out two main conclusions. Firstly, that their strategies are informed by subjective valuations of acceptable costs and potential benefits. And secondly, that these strategies have a lot of diversity and it varies depending on their perception of their position in the homeless continuum. So based on this, Peak has developed a typology of homelessness where she classifies it into crisis homelessness, supplementary homelessness, and survival homelessness. The crisis homeless consider very little choice associated with their condition, whereas supplementary homeless see it as a temporary condition with choice. And the survival homeless have been homeless for a long period of time and tend to invest more towards improving their livelihood within the city. So the three questions I proceeded with was, what were the strategies that the urban homeless implemented? What did these strategies reveal regarding their desirable motivations as well as their capabilities? And how do these strategies vary for different type of homeless populations? So I conducted my research over a period of 6 months in partnership with India Community Social Service Development Society, which runs 2 shelter homes in Bangalore. And I interviewed around 8 key participants in 2 main locations, in Majestic Railway Station and in Tulsi Road. So I'd like to present my findings by beginning with excerpts of the interviews that I conducted with these participants. So firstly, with respect to the crisis homeless. So the first person I spoke to was Abaji, a 70-year-old woman. My story is too emotional. It's not fit to be told on the streets. I used to live with my husband. He was a drunkard and he died on the footpath. I have 4 children. They live with my parents now. The next was Bipin. We are from Shirdi in Maharashtra. We used to beg in the temple there. Somebody told us that people are generous in Bangalore, so we came here to beg. We are respectable people. We have just gotten stuck in difficulty now. So looking at their strategies, one clear desirable motivation that emerges is to survive in the here and now. So there was a very definite present time orientation where instead of making concrete long-term plans, they employed a threshold-based approach. So for example, Bipin said that until he could earn enough to buy his ticket to go back home, he would live in Bangalore. And while he lived in Bangalore, his priority was to find a safe place to sleep. So that brings us to the second desirable motivation, which was about finding favorable locales. And the railway station as a place in itself played a key role in their strategies. For example, Abaji spoke about how because the railway station had multiple comings and goings, it meant that people did not bother her as much. And there was also a gendered aspect to this. As a woman, she was safer in the railway station than if she was sleeping on the streets. In terms of capabilities, both Bipin and Abaji spoke about their livelihoods that they pursued before, that they didn't pursue anymore. And when I asked Bipin why he was not able to pursue these livelihoods, he mentioned how aspects of place-specific knowledge, such as spatial familiarity and social connections, were important for him, and these acted as barriers. The second capability that they spoke about was their rural assets and social relations. So while most of Bipin's plans were short-term plans, the one long-term plan he had in place was to secure his daughter's marriage by selling off his land in his rural habitat. Similarly, Abaji was able to rely on her parents for the care of her children. Now moving to supplementary homeless. Interestingly enough, so I met this participant in the same place that I encountered the crisis homeless, and that points to the inadequacy of accommodation-oriented understandings of homelessness. So this is what Shiva, 30-year-old Mason, told me. I've been coming to Bangalore from my village in Yadgiri for 10 years now. Yesterday, I had returned from my village, but when I reached here, my contractor told me that he would be a few days late. So we decided to wait for him here. He's a good man. Once he comes, he will arrange food, work, and stay for us. So in terms of desirable motivations, there was a clear orientation towards augmenting his rural livelihood. Shiva's wish was to build a home in his village. And as such, even though he could afford expenditures like rent or vehicles, he deemed it as wasteful because it would disrupt his savings pattern. Secondly, all his strategies were anchored around his employment arrangement, especially his relationship with his contractor. Even though he was a daily wage worker, he described himself as permanent with this contractor. And one of the major reasons why he found his contractor to be good is the fact that his contractor gave him advances every time he needed. On the flip side, this sort of tied him to a debt cycle, but in Shiva's mind, he interpreted it as benevolence. In terms of capabilities, a major factor that propelled Shiva's upward mobility is the fact that he was able to upskill himself from an unskilled laborer to becoming a mason. While part of it was about self-initiative, part of it was also the presence of enabling relationships in his life. And this is where the second capability, the transmuted rural community that he had comes into play. So over the years, Shiva had become part of an urban community, and this urban community was in fact a transmuted version of his rural community. So there was an established migration stream from his village with this contractor to Bangalore. And it ended up in a situation where Shiva said that he, even in his work site, he was surrounded by his fellow villagers. And he was in fact able to get in touch with this contractor through fellow villagers who had migrated before. So finally, coming to the survival homeless. So this was a community of bamboo seed traders who were living in blue tarpaulin tents on Tulsi Road. So this is what Vijay Raj, one of them, told me. I've been here for 3 generations. We trade in clean bamboo seeds. We buy them in wholesale and then go to different areas in the city and sell them. Since our fathers and forefathers' time, we have been doing this work. Usually there are around 80 to 100 of our people on this street. Living in the city is much better because here we are at least able to make some money. So in terms of desirable motivations, once again, all the strategies were configured around the pursuit of their economic activity. And for this specific location was very critical because it was accessible to transport, market, as well as vital services such as public tap and public toilet. Because of these multiple benefits and their long-term habitation, Vijayaraj called the footpath space that he lived on the inheritance that his father had left him. The community was unequivocal about the fact that they saw their future in the urban, but at the same time, they took a lot of effort to maintain their rural existence, for example, by going back to their village to vote. And the reason for this is that the proof of their existence within state regimes and the vital access to welfare that it provided them was anchored within the urban, and so therefore they had to ensure that they were not marked dead within the state regimes. In terms of capability, an important strength for this community was the group level configuration of their strategies, which meant that both tasks as well as shocks could be distributed at the group level. And especially for new migrants, it gave them automatic access to the shared socioeconomic networks that had been accumulated over time. Another vital strength was the credibility that this community was able to build with their surroundings. So they spoke about how the shopkeepers would keep a lookout on their possessions, how the police officers allowed them to use the public tap. And so this gave them a tenuous, but a tacit sort of tenure security. So in conclusion, each of these accounts reveals how the urban homeless have their own conceptions of valuable beings and doings. The crisis homeless organize their strategies as thresholds in order to adapt to the exigencies that presented itself. The supplementary homeless had a clear directionality in their strategies, with priority given to the flow and accumulation of socioeconomic capital in their rural habitats, whereas for the survival homeless, maintenance of the optimal habitational and livelihood configurations that they had developed over the years was their priority. However, there were some priorities that emerged as common in all of these accounts. One was a search for favorable locales, places with multiple comings and goings that could simultaneously disperse benefits and opportunities, as well as shield transgressions and territorializations. The other was the accrual of beneficial social relations and economic networks. Overall, the urban homeless emerged neither as victims or heroes, but as ordinary in the complexity, multiplicity, and diversity of their strategies. I'll stop my presentation here, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next paper. Paolo and team, if you all could, pull up your presentation on a portolan of marginalities, a case study of homeless in Rome. The next paper also speaks to the previous paper, and we'll pick this up in the question and answers.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes,
Hope
we
so.
can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this challenging conference. I'm very honored to be part of this sharing knowledge. So this research that I'm presenting is still going on. Is based in Rome, in a group of researchers based on the University of La Sapienza. This case studies investigate the emergent quality of public space, and the idea is to involve homeless people that are part of an emergency shelter that are placed in Rome. Despite Italy is considered as a prosperous nation, in the last period there is a process of impoverishment that changed quite a lot the structure of the country. In particular, the COVID pandemic, the progress of the increasing migration wave, and in particular also the structure that put a wage low and low. These three main factors are define a new kind of a social exclusion, and changing the way also through the public urban space is reconfigured. So Rome is not an homogeneous space, is a jagged space with a different angle of area, zone of migration, internal border, where south and north overlap significantly. It's not homogeneous. It's very complicated city. So the intention of this research, this ongoing research, is to put the homeless at the center, starting from their voice, and particularly from their knowledge, the experiential, aesthetic, and affective knowledge, to define the quality of urban public space. So to define an issues of quality of public space that is empirical and not normative. So three basic assumptions of homeless. First, homeless are not people who lack something. They hold some knowledge, particularly knowledge. Second, homeless are not passive. They are able, they transform, change the urban public space continuously. And the third is the homeless are not incompetent. Quite opposite, they are very inventive. They're very inventive to survive first of all. And then 5 proposition on homelessness. So first, this condition is not is something that is processual, is not a status that describing a static and stable condition. The second point is that everyone nowadays in Italy could enter into this condition. There is not a kind of profile, a single profile related to the homeless. And so this is also the third point. There is no single profile of the homeless. The fourth point is the number of homeless in Italy is increasingly significantly, in particular in Rome. Rome is the Italian city with the highest number of homeless people. And the last proposition is that marginal people are active and purpose-driven to reframe the division between south and north inside the urban space. Taking from this point of view, we are able really to grasp a new definition also of in this kind of spatial term. So also, what as was said before, homeless are out-of-place people. They living exclusively in a public space. They don't have a home. They don't have any alternative just to stay in a public space. For them, they live in a kind of hyper visibility, as also was mentioned in the panel in the paper before. For them, it's a kind of impossible to hide. It's a kind of impossibility to hide. The third point, in Italy, homeless people are living in Via Modesta Valenti. Via Modesta Valenti is like Neverland. It's a street that is not there, that it doesn't exist in Rome. It's a fictionary address for the homeless. It's an imaginary address. Modesta Valenti was a homeless woman who died in the city. After emergency service refused to help her. And homeless people are, let's say, forced to register in Via Modesta Valenti to catch and to be able to have a specific right, like welfare right, voting. Otherwise, in Italy, if you're not root in a particular address, you're not exist. Literally, you're simply a ghost. I put a selection of places in Rome that emerge from the interview. Homeless people usually love to stay in an empty church, in particular in the morning, the city center, because empty church is a kind of is a place where they became invisible. Finally, they transform a playground in a safe place to sleep. Since sleeping outside is very dangerous, is very complicated. Then they usually they use the bus as a place to sleep during the day, to catch up the day, because they are buses warm and dry, and the air are considered a safe place, in particular for homeless women. Hospital also is a place where they stay a lot, where they can queuing and waiting and spend their time, their empty time, since most of them claim that there are too much free time to fulfill for them. And finally, the last space that I mentioned is a train station. It's considered a kind of free zone where they can play the let's pretend. They pretend to be travelers. They pretend to play this fiction as if to play different role that is not the role of the homeless. So what is emerged is a contingent use of a public space. The public space emerged as contingent is determined by unpredictable use to the expense of those precise functions from which it was designed. Homeless people are able to define unplanned use of the public space. Of course, the use of something is something that is capable of friction and is something that has a kind of retroacts on the people that can use transforming behavior, gesture, and posture. What also emerge is a kind of emergence of a social identity of place which replace the social identity. Homeless people has a few relationship with other people in the same group. First of all, because in the hostile environment of a street, the interview reveal an attitude of mistrust. And also because the second point is because they consider homeless status temporary and transitionary. And so they don't identify themselves with others that experience the same condition. So this kind of difficult to elaborate the process of decent mobility is counterbalanced by the importance of physical and spatial context in which they are located. So what is emerged is a kind of urban hybrid space. The public space is emerged a very hybrid, where the public space emerge as a place where there is a co-presence between a private space and a public space. This public and private space are very these divisions are overwhelmed by the knowledge and by the presence of the homeless. So the hybrid space is designed is also a space of conflict. Is a conflict between a collective dimension, between a social inclusion and exclusion, between collective norms and practices. But also remembering what yesterday was mentioned is particularly in the panel 5 of thinking through marginalities. This space, this hybrid space, the spaces of the conflicts, is also the place where to reinvent our institution, to reinvent in particular the role of universities, our public institution. So I will stop here and maybe follow into the question later on. Thank you once more time for this great chance.
Thank you, Paolo. We'll move over to Sigrid and his paper on the ghetto as a make-believe space on state discourses and contestations of urban marginality in Denmark's social housing areas. Over to you, Sigrid.
Thanks so much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope that works. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, we can see your presentation. Over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. And it's great to be here at Unpacking Marginalities conference with you all. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Sigrid Corey. I'm a PhD student at the LSE. And the work I'd like to present today is based on a period of fieldwork I conducted in the so-called ghetto areas of Denmark after the launching of exceptional legislation that targets these areas in particular. So my ethnography was conducted in the areas of Tingbjerg and Mjølnerparken, two of Denmark's most contested housing areas in Copenhagen. And I spent 2 months here speaking to residents and activist groups as the plans were announced and the laws are now under implementation. So in this paper, I'd like to engage with the idea of urban marginality in Denmark through the politics of race, space, and legal exception that emerging in these housing areas. I'm asking from the point of view of Danish ghettoized communities, what can be revealed about state-sanctioned processes of social and racialized dispossession and its contestations. So my argument is that the ghetto is not a given category. Rather, it's instantiated in what I borrow from Yale Navarro as termed as a make-believe space. And by this, I mean a both imaginative construction as well as a very physical reality that takes place on the ground. And so I'm interested in this changing regime of urban marginality that I see to have emerged in Denmark through my fieldwork, and the ways in which it shifts dynamics of social housing as a whole and welfare state structures too. So starting off with the idea of the ghetto in itself and how it came about as a state terminology. So the Danish government issued in their policy proposal this definition of the ghetto, which they distinguish from a so-called deprived housing area. So a deprived housing area meets at least 2 out of the 4 following criteria. So there's at least 40% unemployment. The average income is under 55% of the national average. Over 60% only have basic schooling, and 3 times the national average have a criminal record. So this then becomes a ghetto if at least 50% of residents are immigrants or descendants from so-called non-Western countries. So here we have the writing in of this term of non-Western into Danish state policy, and that created a lot of international uproar. So in terms of the discourses of what the ghetto is in the eyes of the state and in public discourses, I think it would be good to engage with this notion of the holes in the Danish map. And this was said by the then Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen in 2018. So he says, around the country, there are parallel societies. Many people with the same problems are lumped together, and this creates a negative spiral, a counterculture. He states that ghettos send their tentacles out into the streets, and criminals create insecurity, reaching into to threaten Danish values such as equality, open-mindedness, tolerance, and that these are places where one does not take responsibility, one does not participate in society, and people set themselves outside. And I've included here in my presentation a map of Denmark where these different what the state terms to be ghettos are marked onto the map, and you can see these are in the major cities mostly. So the policy proposed to have no more parallel societies by 2030, and this idea of the parallel society is very closely entwined with the idea of the ghetto. So they kind of use this term interchangeably. And the policy proposed a set of measures that firstly were the introduction of heightened punishment zones. So you have increased punitive measures in these areas. And this is accompanied by physical restructuring of the social housing areas. So the drawing up of flexible rent contracts in order to enable more evictions. 11,000 people were set for eviction. And this then would be part of a wider move towards the privatization of housing structures, of housing areas, as well as its demolitions of several housing areas across the country. And this was accompanied also by social restructuring. So there's a social dimension to it. So in terms of who was allowed to move into these areas, it would be people who were not receiving state benefits, As well as this, there was the idea of the compulsory nursery from the age of 1. And this would be with the intention of spreading more quote unquote Danish values and ideas. So I was really engaging with how this was perceived on the ground by residents, by people who are living in these spaces, experiencing these discourses in their everyday life. And I want to just share a few quotes from people that I spoke to, which shows this kind of lived reality that the ghettoization discourses and policies have on the lives of people. So one person I spoke to said, "You start to hide that you come from Tingbia," and she explained that she had her friend of hers had stopped putting her address, the real address, in order to get more prospects for job interviews. And she says, "I stopped saying that I come from Tingbia to stop people feeling like there's a distance between us and them." And so the notion of the ghetto is part of entrenching this sort of othering that is very felt by this resident, for example. Another person says, "We feel excluded from society. We live in isolation. No matter what we do, we are not seen as part of society. We're seen as a burden. And this is because of two things: the way we dress and the fact that we live in a so-called ghetto." And so this, I think, points to this notion that Louis Vaconque terms the territorial stigmatization, which I think very clearly was existing in the Danish ghettos too. And so not just was different kinds of urban marginalization were taking place, but this was a particularly spatialized form of marginality that came about. A particularly important finding, I think, was this notion of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So most residents did not identify with the notion of the ghetto. They didn't see this to exist. They saw this as an external imposition, really instantiated by the state. And they used this notion of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So one person said, "This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe in the idea of a parallel society, you create it, you realize it." And another said, "I feel like they create the parallel society which they are so scared of. The government is going out and making laws for particular areas, and that's what a parallel society is." And so they point to this paradox that where it didn't exist before, now there is a sort of differentiation that is taking place in the urban landscape. And here I'm including just a picture to show the demolitions taking place, and just to point out that this is not just a discursive turn, but it's also a very concrete reality, and that this is kind of an ongoing process with its end in 2030. So a lot of residents were, of course, contesting these laws, and they were organizing around the group called Elmin Mustan, which translates as something like Common Resistance. And this was a broad coalition of residents and activists who lived in these ghettoized areas, organizing to claim better social housing conditions for all. And they saw this policy not just as an attack on racialized minorities, but they saw it as an attack on the social welfare state and on social housing in general in Denmark. And there was one particular quote that I'd like to highlight from a speech that I attended, a demonstration that I attended in Copenhagen, where one of the leading activists said, "Politicians are claiming to be creating security, but they've created nothing but insecurity. The essence of social housing is that we can feel secure in our accommodation and the decisions that we collectively take through democratic means." And I think this points to this critique of the securitization that the government is creating in these areas, in their kind of exceptionalizing of the areas as spaces of criminality and insecurity. Actually, activists are saying, no, real security is that we can have a safe place to live. So just coming to the conclusions of my findings, I think we can see with these ghetto legislations, the way that they're instantiated, the discourses around them, and the way that they're contested, there is a kind of emerging new regime of urban marginality in Denmark. And the state has played a key role in this, in the production and distribution of urban marginality in Denmark. I think it's clear that there is a kind of paradox emerging too, in which the ghetto is a make-believe space. So it's both discursively and bureaucratically constructed. It exists as a kind of imaginary, as a place of countercultures and a place of threats, but it's that's happening in order to enable a wider change in the political economy of social housing and welfare structures. So it's instantiated in order to be dismantled. And I think this is different from other cases of ghettoization, which are more just solely focused on containment or strategies of containment and more punitive measures. This is more, it's contained in order to be dispersed. So it's fundamentally restructuring housing landscapes. And lastly, it's being contested continuously, and this is still ongoing, in which residents are pointing to the contradictions of the Danish social welfare state, critiquing the fact that housing is only guaranteed for some and not for others, and defending the right for housing and secure homes for all. So I think I'd like to end my presentation there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We will now open up for question and answers. I request you all online to start putting up your questions in the chat box, or the chat box or the Q&A box, sorry. I will like to use my privileges as the chair to begin the question answer session. My first question is to Minu, is to Sneha, Paolo, and Sigrid. What you are pointing out in your presentations is that the language that we're using, the categories that we're using around this word marginalization is either lacking or it's doing more harm in some ways to the people that we are speaking about. And I was curious to know if, through your research, you came across any new categories that you think could be used to speak about the spaces that you are studying and the people that you're studying. And sort of like as a follow-up, especially on the homelessness issue, what does this mean for our practices around trying to provide housing for the homeless? And this comes from a personal space because I am on the impartial committee for homelessness. And in that, a lot of times the language is used, of dependence is used to sort of, tug at the moral fiber of the people in the room and say, oh, the government should do something about it. They can't do anything for themselves. Look at the kind of, crisis situation they are in. And if you're saying that this language is doing more harm, what's the alternative sort of like languages that we should be using? What are the kinds of sort of recommendations that you have for practice? And this is also to open up the practice question to Rekha and Induja over here. You've given us an example of a process that actually helped people, move up through social acceptance, through asset creation. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the process they followed to get this housing, because is there something that can be replicated by other groups that are marginalized, that are vulnerable? And finally, for Sagar, so I understand that the method that you have used is actually very good in trying to help us understand at a very large scale that a type has been replaced, right? Like there used to be an old type that you sort of find out using your GIS maps, and then a new type has come and replaced that. But I was wondering, but you're using that to kind of speak about gentrification. And I was wondering that in your study, whether you found anything about the original inhabitants of the place being replaced by new inhabitants. What is the kind of habitation? Is it a cohabitation or did the original inhabitants move out? Is it different for different parts of Bangalore? And I was curious about that. So I will start off with these questions, and then the mics, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I see Sai already has a question online, but Sai, you'll have to wait after my questions.
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. So, yes, the word marginalization. I think I had more of a question of using the word housing. That's why I said I don't know if I belong in the panel.
Right.
But yes, even marginalization is I don't think it creates harm, but it is, I don't think, is the self-perception of the people there. So this is why I use the word accommodation, as they are provided an accommodation in the city, and that's like an employee. I also had an issue. I'm just saying the issues that I had. I'm probably not sure if I have a new category. I think I should do more work. Even in saying that they are formally constructed as part of the building, the living spaces that they actually are in, but there is an informal nature of work. So there are certain things that you can't fit into these categories in that sense, which is why there's need for nuance when we use the categories. I don't actually know if I can yet say any more new categories. I'll just stop there.
Should we move on to you, Sneha?
Yeah, sure. So, this was a question that came up in the research, because as a researcher, I was looking at homelessness. And so the participants that I met, I was identifying them on the basis of their housing circumstance. But when I spoke to them, that's not how they define themselves. They define themselves more in terms of their economic identity or the kind of work that they were doing. So I think that in itself was something that made me think about how they see themselves as residents within the city. The linkage between their housing circumstance and their economic identity is something that's very interlinked. And so even when we think of what sort of housing solutions need to be provided, it needs to acknowledge this interlinkage between the economic activity being their priority and the housing being an addendum to that sort of identity that they have. And so especially for me, if the question that you put forward in terms of practice, what are the implications over here? I think the way we think about housing as a stagnant entity, as a physical space, is something that the especially in Indian cities, the kind of merging of rural and urban backgrounds that you have and the kind of mobile populations that you have, that stagnancy is something that needs to be questioned and rethought. And so in terms of practice, the kind of housing solutions that we need to think about are ones that can accommodate for this circularity and flexibility within their living conditions, how they move between the urban to the rural and back and forth. So yeah.
Paolo, would you like to add to that?
Yes. So in terms of my presentation doesn't refer anything about social housing, despite social housing is very related to the problem of homeless. Despite my research was with homeless that are in emergency shelter. The problem of social housing in Rome is a huge topic, since on the public level, and also since in Rome there is a huge movement of occupation of squat house to properly address and put the issues of house at the center. So the issues of self-management of the house, how the right could be fulfilled through a conflict, is very a hot topic in this city since years. About the new categories, honestly, in the research I didn't found a new way, let's say, to reframe these issues of marginality. Since I think marginality is also a new category for sociologists, for academic studies, let's say, is very quite recent, And I think that is vague enough. The notion of category is a quite also quite rich category, and I'm pretty sure that we are just now starting to understand properly this category. Let's say giving space more, giving appropriate knowledge on this category. So we, let's say, try to digging into this category, finding a new meaning, a new chance to knowledge more.
Thank you for that. And I was also thinking about when you were speaking about hybrid spaces and how do we sort of, perceive public space as a hybrid space, just the acceptance of that perception of it being used for different kinds of things, including, people staying, is new, but that itself in some ways allows some kind of buffer for people who are, just coming into the city in some ways. I'd like to move over to Sigrid, and if there's anything you'd like to add to this?
Sure. Yeah. I think for me, in my fieldwork, language was central to the way in which people perceived their place in the city, their place in more generally, in terms of their positionality and of marginality. And so I think the category of ghetto was not self-evident at all. It was highly contested. It was highly contested both by residents and non-residents. And I think that this was a greater appeal in the campaigns that were being made, that to have this idea of the non-Western taken out of legislation, that this should not be written into law, and that this was creating these kinds of forms of othering, forms of marginalization. And I don't think that there was a particular answer into how do they want to be termed. I think they just didn't want to be excluded. They didn't want to be not have equality before the law, and these were the central claims, just to have equal rights, have equal citizenship. And I think this idea of Danishness became a very big point in which that was contested, because these areas being set outside the identity of the nation, being set as different, then its residents were being stigmatized as or labeled as non-Danish in some way. And that was a values-based judgment rather than anything real. And so I think it was more at this point of refusal rather than saying that, oh, we are something else. I didn't see a particular label emerging. Rather, it was just this refusal of exceptional legislative treatment by the government.
I actually want to elaborate on what you wanted ask me.
Yeah.
So transgender people were usually given housing on rental basis only in slums, mostly. So when the Chennai city was facing a housing problem and the resettlement process started for the river restoration projects or to construct the elevated corridors, these people were resettled to the outskirts of the city, which was far away, 30-40 kilometers far away from their main source of livelihood. So what happened is that these people were resettled, and both men and women were given households, but these transgenders who were on a rental basis in those slums were not given the housing. So it was not an easy task for them. They fought for almost 6 to 7 years. They wrote letters, they put petitions to the slum clearance board, and they even went in person in groups, and they even started their own NGO called Sneha, the one which you saw. Yeah, they collected stories from all the transgenders throughout the Chennai city, and they went to the Tamil Nadu Urban Habitat Development Board, and they gave a petition in person. And only after that, on an experimental basis, the 8 blocks which were on the corner of the resettlement site, which the general public didn't want, because it's on the outer end, and we didn't want to access a house which is far away from the main resettled area. So these blocks were given to them, and they happily accepted it. and they happily accepted it. And those 8 blocks were, the main area of these transgender peoples, and they, put their own ways in which they could develop their livelihood. So what we look at here and how they were socially mobilized is that women were also given the same thing, and the transgenders were also given the same housing. But there was a drastic change in how transgenders developed and progressed in their lives, and how women were in contrast. So I would say that due to the patriarchal norms and in the family or household, women were not able to flourish. On the other hand, transgenders broke their barriers of housing, and they, took up the strength and power to develop and progress themselves. And they were also able to provide housing to the younger transgenders who are coming into their own group. And many of them took up social work. Many of them, took up work related to artists, and they got government projects, and a lot of positive stories from these group. And later on, what happened? The government, the initial stage, they gave 8 blocks separately, and after that, the next resettlement sites of Perumbakam and Okiyam, there they mixed up the transgender people with the public. And there was no opposition at all. And they now live together. And in Perumbakam, the association head is a transgender woman. Yeah. So that's it.
Sagar, over to you.
Your first question was that original, whether I was able to find out original inhabitant or not. So
yeah, because in the sense that when you're speaking about gentrification, like the question I had was whether the original inhabitants could stay put in some way or the other, or that they were displaced, or they chose to move out. Is there any sort of study on that in addition to your spatial mapping?
The short answer, I'll say that I didn't interview the original inhabitant, that those were replaced, because if they're replaced, they are not there anymore. They are gone to some other place and staying there. But I did find out their neighborhood. In the neighborhood, there are a lot of people who helped me to understand that these are the houses where new inhabitant came from the other states, or the new inhabitant came from the other part of the Bangalore.
Yeah.
Language was obviously one of the biggest barrier for me. Being from a Hindi background or speaking in English or Hindi, it's very difficult to speak in the local language and understand each and every word.
Yeah.
So I did try to find out a few people who can speak English or Hindi, and they told me that in these neighborhoods, these are the families who came from outside. And I tried to find out people from the age, from in between age of like 30 to 40s or 45, so that they can tell me something around from one generation above them and one generation after the newer generation that is coming. So I can get a whole figure of roughly around 30 to 40 years, because they are staying there for like 30, 40 years. So they can tell ki what all has happened through from their childhood and how the area is growing. So how exactly, if I can't say that my spatial analysis can confirm that if the original inhabitant are displaced or not, but with the interviews from the people that were residing there, I can say that the new gated enclaves or the commercial complexes that are coming up, they are mostly coming after one after another. Like initially, it was just a low-rise structure of 1 or 2 floors, and their kids moved out. They started to send money to their family, and they also started building another floor to it. And they have rented out their upper floors. Like earlier, it was 2 floors. Now they have gone to 3 floors, and they have rented the 3rd floor. And slowly, few industries started coming up, or the knowledge economy industries started coming up, and the people start investing in those areas. So after the gated community would come up, like 1 or 2 gated community wouldn't make much of a difference. But as soon as like 10 or 12 gated community come, there will be a new cafe or a new boutique or a new supermarket start to coming up in those areas, maybe a theater. And slowly those areas started to grow in a posh area. and now they are their locality or those low-rise structure are so limited limited or so confined to a very small place that around their whole neighborhood there is just gated community all around, and the people residing there either those people have rented their own space, and the people who are renting those space are working in those gated community, maybe as a security guard or as a house help or something like that. Your second question was whether I can say that gentrification is limited to neighborhood or to a city scale. Whether I can say that gentrification is I can say that it's in the whole Bangalore city or not. So as far as what I have studied and what my analysis says, no, gentrification right now is a neighborhood-based phenomenon, not a city-wide phenomenon. But my research is still in the initial preliminary phase. I'll have to study more, and then only I can conclude whether it is city-wide or neighborhood phenomenon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to, can we take a couple of questions together?
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentations. I had a question for Paolo, but I think it connects with all of your presentations because it's related to imagination and the way people define themselves and construes their own condition and situation. I think, Paolo, you mentioned something about the train station as a space in which the homeless people could use fiction to reinvent themselves or to tell stories about who they were. And I was very interested in this part. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about this idea of fiction or of, because I think, in the text that I study, storytelling or the social function of, telling stories to each other is critical. And it's just that I wanted to know more. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. So my question was again to Paolo. I'm sorry if I missed and you already addressed it. You spoke about how homeless people think of themselves as in a transitionary state, like they are not homeless in a long term, they are homeless in a very short term. How closer that to the truth? Like, is that really transitionary or is it not? And like usually what is the time period, whatever? For how long usually they are homeless and how long do they face it? And my second question, a short question, was to Sagar. You spoke about 3 different types of gentrification, inbuilt, peripheral and everything. At the same time, there's another sort of categorization of gentrification, which is agent-led, state-led, individual. So is there like some parallel to your category and these categories? Like for example, the outbound gentrification is state-led and like the inbuilt is sort of agents-led. Is there some sort of parallel? Like, are the agents of gentrification different in different kind of gentrification? That was my question. Over to her.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, one for Sagar and one for Minu. To Sagar, short question, so do you see gentrification as an independent phenomena? Like you just spoke about how apartments were coming around in newer places, older places, but there would be a lot other things happening. So how do you see gentrification as a process for larger population as well? And for Minu, I have a question about how provision of such accommodation played a role for the salaries and incomes. Why I say this, in my previous research among domestic workers in Delhi, I found many employers were using this provision as an implicit rent. Like they were not paid cash wages because your families are made to stay in this. And there were very few cases where they were even charged electricity bills, like no wages, plus workers were made to pay electricity bills. So how these provisions were used by the landlords?
Okay.
We'll take one last question.
Sorry.
2?
Yeah, so I had a question for Sneha. I was just wondering about your methods. I mean, I don't know much about homelessness, but I mean, I just saw a distinct, difference between the way, let's say, Paolo was interviewing people, which I felt was in kind of a bounded space. I think he centered his research around the homeless shelter, and then it sort of went to other spaces. But you, and I might have understood this wrong, but you were sort of finding these people in the wild almost. Or let's say in a railway station where I know there are families who kind of sleep there waiting for the next train or so many changes or whatever. So I was just wondering, like, how did you identify these, like, who is homeless, right? Just because, if someone is, having a house in a village and is maybe camping in the city for like a couple of days, like, in Indian homeless literature, like, are they categorized in the same way as maybe we conceptualize homelessness, let's say in the West, where it's like a completely different form of precarity? So yeah, I was just wondering whether your research thing talks about any of that.
So I have a question for Minu, Sneha, and okay. So first, Minu, I was wondering that these people, these watchman communities and people, they come from perhaps a village or when they settle in the city, though the same gender, caste, class relations exist, but they are organized and structured differently in cities. So in this case, in this analysis of marginalities, are you also going to look at how they are trying to make sense of this urban city life, and therein they might get involved in conflicts where they can be the antagonists or they can be antagonized against, like simple relations, like they might not be able to make sense of how relationships are, and different kind of fragmented societies, how society is fragmented, the society is more cosmopolitan, how to, what to say to whom, what not. They might target single women living in the society and sort of discipline them more. So are you going to look at that, like how their worldview changes, how they're trying to make sense, and therein what problems happen? Sneha, I was wondering, I did a study way back during my master's on homelessness and beggary, and I found that homelessness was a result of multiple displacement of communities who are poor. They might have migrated from the village seasonally during the non-rainy seasons or during the dull seasons of farming. But they have been, and there are some communities who are displaced multiple times in cities. When they camp on any sort of empty land and that land gets developed, they have to move out. And therein they lose their house multiple times, and in the process they become homeless. So are you looking at a larger question in homelessness? When you're trying to look at homelessness, are you trying to analyze or answer a larger question? And to Induja and Rekha, I was wondering, why do you use the word positive deviant? Is it because of their status as sex workers earlier? So I was just wondering, it's interesting. So I was wondering, and thanks for showing that how even providing various kind of identity by the state along with housing, how they go hand in hand in sort of like a rehabilitation or reintegration of these communities with the mainstream society.
Okay, we'll get the answers now. We're over time, so let's start.
Can I answer the question first? So why we use positive deviance is that in comparison to women who are given the same, facilities, and to transgenders, the transgenders showed progress, and whereas the women did not. Yeah, so they are because they have a growth towards the positive factor. When given the same facility, they grow towards the positive side. No, it was not it. Towards the positive side. That's it.
I have a very quick response to both of you. Yes, I don't know your name. I'm sorry. Shraddha, I actually don't know about the breakup of the income or salary or wages or whatever we call it, which is why I said they augment their income going into individual apartments and all of those things. I actually don't know that question. Thank you for asking, because I will have to go back and find that out. To Sneha, that's a very larger question about whether their worldview changes because they've come to the city. I personally can tell you, even among the educated people so-called educated people that we live in the universities with, worldviews have not changed just because they are in the urban. But yes, do they have the power to reinforce those things? I don't think so. Like the landlord that gatekeeps who comes in and who does not get to, stay in a place which is real. I do not think the watchman communities have the same kind of power. I'll just leave it there. I think we go to other questions.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll go online after.
Thank you, Shashwat and Shraddha, both for asking both the questions. To Shashwat, state-led gentrification or agent-based gentrification. I think that both the terms are a little broader with what what analysis I am trying to do. Like maybe if we talk about policies, if some enclave or gated community are coming up, the government policy becomes such that FAR increases or the land prices increase. So it becomes difficult to identify all sort of gentrification in agent-based or state-based. So my research is, I think, a little deep down, more deeper than if we compared based upon state-led or agent-based gentrification. Coming on to Shraddha, you asked about independent phenomena. It's a larger phenomena. I can't exactly say, but I'll try to answer in a way that yesterday there was one presentation given by Aditi where she talked about Nadi ke is par and Nadi ke us par. So every urban planning policy is not independent of their own. It's interrelated with one or another. So like she talked about how Nadi ke us par there were a Muslim community living, and all of us, and slowly Hindu people residing there start to coming towards the other side of the river. The community that started coming out, it's not that they become gentrified. It's like there is some issues on that side, how people are relating them. So I'll say that gentrification it's not independent of its own. Maybe it's some part of it it's social, some part of it is economical, and some part of it might be a social phenomenon also.
Okay, thank you. We'll move online now. Paolo?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the first about the train station as a place to play. Yes, a lot of people that we interviewed that was stay in the station, they played the game of let's pretend to be travelers, usually also because they have a big suitcase, so they embody this kind of role. Yes, let's say is related to the storytelling, but the storytelling, let's say, is embodied in a performance. They perform this storytelling in a very different way, and this game is very close to the children a game of let's pretend. Let's pretend of being older than what they really are, to meet their needs, feelings, events that are not really happening or are not present. Or also maybe they take trains to move within the city as a proper traveler. No? So they move from the south to north, to the north to the south, maybe 2-3 times, 3 times per day as a performance. About the time of homelessness, most of the people are homeless since a few months, let's say 4 or 5 months, and there are other people that were interviewed also were homeless since 1 year, 1 year and a half. Some of them were, let's say, homeless that were found home, then they lost again. So it's very complicated rhythm, let's say, of being homeless on this process. Just let me say one thing about the notion of hybrid space that was asked me at the first. I borrowed the notion of hybrid space from Bruno Latour, and let's say the idea also is to unpack the notion of hybrid, let's say as a way to reframe our epistemology nowadays, let's say to challenging this pure categorization that, according to Bruno Latour, belong to the Enlightenment movement. What does it mean nowadays? Let's say to make pure categories engage with other, how to deal in an epistemological way through a category that are able, let's say, to go beyond, let's say, the classical dualism of the modernity. Yeah. So this was, let's say, the main issue. Thank you very much.
Sneha, can you?
Yeah, sure. So, with respect to methodology, so I had approached an organization that manages shelter homes. And I had actually, so in a way, I was relying on their definition of what they saw as homeless. And so they first helped me reach out to people in the railway station, and then to the community that was living in blue tarpaulin tents in Tulsi Road. And so in a way, I had started with the official or state-based definitions of homelessness, but through the process, there was a fragmentation of those definitions. In these blue tarpaulin tents had homes within their villages, and so they wouldn't call themselves as homeless. And secondly, with respect to the question on how multiple displacements sort of underlie the condition, the circumstance of homelessness, I did witness that with.
Okay, we are going to have to end here.
In my studies, especially with the.
Sneha, we are going to have to end here because there's a lot of disconnect right now on the internet. So I'm going to have to stop this here. Also, we are very over time. Any last things you want to say, Sigrid, and then we can just end it after that. Is there anything else you want to say? Otherwise, we can end the session.
No, I think happy to end there. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. You can catch the participants later. I know that there must be a lot of other questions that we haven't answered yet. Thank you so much.